instead of addressing the person's argument, what you do is you address a feature of the person that's not relevant to the argument. So, to take a stupid person, or to take a stupid example, if you, Lucas, were to say, that you think 12 multiplied by 11 equals 132, and you laid out your reasons for that, and I just said, hey, that's the wrong answer. You're just a white guy saying that. So what I'm clearly doing is I'm not addressing your mathematical reasoning and assessing it in its own terms. I'm setting that aside and I'm focusing on your skin color, which is irrelevant to the quality of your mathematical reasoning.
Welcome to the Lucas Grobot Show, where we uncover purpose, relentlessly pursue truth, and own the future. I'm your host, Lucas Grobot, and today we are joined by Dr. Steve Hicks, who I am just utterly honored that I get to talk to him today. Dr. Stephen Hicks is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University, Illinois, USA, the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship, and a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. He has 4 books explaining postmodernism, Nietzsche and the Nazis, The Art of Reasoning, and Entrepreneurial Living. His writings have been translated into 16 languages: Portuguese, Spanish, Korean, Persian, Polish, Arabic, Ukrainian, many more. He has been published in academic journals such as Business Ethics Quarterly, Teaching Philosophy, and Review of Metaphysics, as well as the Wall Street Journal, Cato Unbound, and the Baltimore Sun. In 2010, he won his university's Excellence in Teaching Award and has been a visiting professor of business ethics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., a visiting fellow at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center in Bowling Green, Ohio, senior fellow at the Objectivist Center in New York, and the visiting professor at the University of Casimir the Great, Poland. He received his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Guelph, Canada, and his PhD in philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington, USA. As I mentioned, he is the author of Explaining Postmodernism, and if there is any book that I think that you should be reading right now in these days, it is for sure Dr. Hicks' book. I have been reading it. I've been telling all of my friends about this book that was written 20 years ago, but seems to be so timely for everything that's happening today. So, Dr. Hicks, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Real pleasure to connect across the world this way.
Now, when we originally connected, the world was a very different place. Right now, we're at June 3rd as this recording, but when we connected, the hot topic of May was lockdowns, draconian lockdowns, as some would say. There's a lot of talk about universal basic income, and that seemed to be the conversation. But as we know, we live in a very, very different world today, and I'm sure we're going to hit on that. But so I think my first question is how are you viewing what's happening with the George Floyd killings and then the protests and the riots? Like, how do you view what is going on right now in America and across the world?
Well, that's a big question, scaling out from a particular event, which was terrible, terrifying, right, horrifying in many respects, to the broader implications. And as you know, it was a particular event, though, that pushes people's principled buttons, and all of the big political issues, religious issues, and so forth are triggered. So, in that particular case, I've seen the videos as millions of people have seen, and it seems a very clear case of police brutality, police overstepping the mark. What exactly was going on in the officer's mind, I don't know. Whether it was racism as a contributing factor, But I'm, of course, speculating that there's some element of that, and then we do our further research. Why the other police officers on the scene did not step in. So the initial officer seems primarily involved, but he wasn't a solo agent, and so there are some at least passive abettors of the cause. And then we start to scale out. This is a man and police brutality cases, and we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence that police overreact and use their police powers more than situations are warranted. And anytime that happens, that strikes our sense of justice. And those of us around the world who are committed to a strong sense of justice, we find that incredibly irritating. We know there's a background of race relations. While I'm actually very optimistic about race relations in the United States, I think we've made great progress over the last 2 centuries, in particular the last 2 generations. Whatever the amount of racism that's actually operative is intensely irritating. And it's like a zero tolerance policy is the one that we want to go for. So whether this is an example of systemic racism or not, it nonetheless is incredibly irritating. But then, of course, we have a broader set of issues where we have a large number, at least I'm just going to speak from the American context, of groups with all sorts of causes from all parts of the political spectrum, and a very active media that is more postmodern this generation than any generation previously. And they're always waiting for the right cause to come along to do what it is that they want to do. And some, of course, have their talking points and they get their talking points out. Some people have their action points, some of them destructive, some of them constructive. So what you then end up with is the right event rather comes along at the right moment, and it turns into a zoo.
And that's what we're seeing today. I mean, there's everyone that I have talked to, every commentator that I've listened to, they're all in 100% agreement. This was clearly police brutality. He should be charged. He is being charged. Everyone that I have heard and everyone that I've talked to clearly stand for all the peaceful protests that are going on across America.
Yeah.
As you said, we have there's a zero tolerance. It's not like, we can tolerate some racism, but I think by and large, as a nation, we have set up our ideals to say we will not be a racist country. But then you bring in this.
Let me just interrupt on that point just for one moment. That is, despite the terribleness of everything that's going on, evidence of the great achievements we have made over the course of the last 2 centuries. 50 years ago, you would not have had a zero tolerance policy. You would have had 80% of the population saying bad, 20% making excuses for it. 100 years ago, those numbers would have been 60-40. So in one sense, this is a sign of a good thing.
But that's not what people are saying. They're actually saying the very opposite. I mean, for sure, I'm listening to some voices that are African American, that are of minorities, that are saying, no, this isn't a flag of systemic racism across our entire system. But by and large, the narrative that I am hearing from all the way over here, via media, via talking to friends, through the conversations that I'm having, even one-on-one with people, is that America is deeply racist. It's ingrained in everything that we are. It was founded on evil racism, and that the fact that I am a white male means that I have this white privilege that maybe I'm not aware of, but it's completely baked in by the fact that I was born into a white household, and
Right.
and so.
Yes, let me jump in again. I mean, that's a strong narrative. You hear it everywhere. Every element of what you just said is false.
It's false.
And is false. Every element and every major concept built into that formulation that you very nicely summarized in a paragraph just now. All of that is false, but it is a powerful narrative that is promulgated by any number of intellectuals, journalists, and activists.
But how can you say that it's false? I mean, isn't that their truth? Isn't that their experience? Don't we have to agree with it? Because if I don't agree with it, if I say, okay, I see your pain, I see your suffering, I understand the generational systematic breakdown of the African American population that happened through slavery, and if I don't then accept the latter part, which is saying, and I'm a racist because I'm white, and I have privilege because I'm white, then it only further proves their point to say, well, see, you're totally blind to it. So how can you sit there and say that everything that I just said is actually untrue?
Okay, so now we're getting into some philosophical territory, right? The concept of truth, who defines truth, and under what circumstance are we in a position, right, to say that things are true or not? Now, initially, there's going to have to be a ground rule. If we're going to say there is a narrative that says slavery existed, slavery was horrible, slavery had lingering effects. If we're going to make those claims, what's the status of those claims going to be? Are those claims true or not true? And if you want to, on the one hand, claim that those things are true, then you are committed to a notion of truth, objective truth, and universal truth. So it would be inappropriate if at some point along the line someone else says, well, I disagree with your interpretation of the truth or this implication, or I want to say there's these other factors that need to be taken into account. If at that point you say, oh, that's just your truth, that's not my truth, then you are making an illegitimate move, because then you can't go back and say that your initial claims were universal objective truths. You'd have to just say those are only my personal truths. So right up front, people are going to say, am I committed to there are truths, and we can argue about what the truths are, or is it just going to be you have your talking points, I have my talking points, nobody really has the truth, and we're just going to sort it out, say, on the streets?
So let me help me digest this. So if there's one group, and I guess it could be either group, that looks at a set of evidence and says, this is a truth, this is the truth, this is absolute, and lays out that argument, and you're saying that if someone else comes along, they have the right to challenge that argument and say, well, I look at the factual evidence, I look at the empirical data, and I can level an argument to say, well, there's a little bit more complexity to this situation. And now when the first group says, well, hold on a minute, that's your perspective, this is my perspective, this is my truth, then all of a sudden their truth just has become illegitimate.
Right. Well, then you're saying that everybody's truths are equally illegitimate, right? Including the initial claims that you were making.
So then how can we have a dialectical conversation? How can we have a conversation where we're actually able to reason and sit down and understand one another, right, if all of our perspectives are just, subjective?
Right. So this is right where philosophy, the rubber meets the road. If one believes that all truths are subjective in the sense that you just were articulating, we're never going to have conversations. And so, right, one measure of the problem that we are having right now, with a large number of people not willing to engage in discourses to give the other side a chance to, or take the possibility that their way of thinking about things right now needs to be adjusted. If we have a large number of people like that, that is the sign, I think, of a philosophical corruption. But one implication of that is that we won't actually have debates and discussions about the issues. So my view on this is slavery is a historical fact. Right? It really did happen. Then we could have lots of arguments about what counts as historical evidence, what counts as historical interpretation, the role of hypotheses, how we compare hypotheses in terms of which ones are better or worse in terms of explanation, and also the issues about the character traits that are necessary for people who are going to talk about complicated issues and issues that involve a great deal of controversy and pushing our emotional buttons. All of those are philosophically important issues that have to be dealt with if we're going to take up slavery as a real phenomenon, and it has a legacy, and we need to be able to sort out our thinking. And ultimately, it doesn't matter, right, whether you are born wealthy or born poor, born with this skin hue, born with that skin hue. Ultimately, we should be able to have a good discussion about that fact and the related facts and sort out what the truth is.
So I feel like there are people who are trying to do that. There are people who are doing that, but the argument then that's leveled from the other side is, well, you're doing that from a place of privilege. You're doing that from the place of being a whether it's a white male or any other position of power. It automatically makes your claim illegitimate because you're only viewing that world through your particular lens, and you've actually framed an argument that forces the other person to lose. So how can we, in that situation, how do we actually come to objective truth?
Right. All right, good. So privilege is one of those buzzwords that's being used a lot in the last generation. For the most part, it is an anti-concept. That's to say it's a concept or a word that's used to destroy or undercut other legitimate concepts. Now, there are privileges, right? Privileges are social advantages granted by some people to others. That's kind of within their discretion. So I don't know. Suppose I belong to a tennis club, and one of the options I have is I can bring a friend who's not a member to play at my tennis club twice a week. Right. So that's a privilege. In that case, the tennis club is granting that to me as part of my membership, right, and so on. But what is illegitimate about the way the concept is often used is that there are lots of advantages and differences between human beings that are not privileges. So, for example, I'm 6 feet tall. When I was a teenager, I loved basketball, and I was really hoping that I would grow up to be about 6'6" so that I could play professional basketball. So, someone though who is naturally born to grow up to be 6'6", compared to me, who is 6 feet, that person has an advantage. He's 6'6", I am 6 feet, but that's not a privilege. Right? That is a natural advantage in that context that individual has. So what has happened is that, and this is an illegitimate move, is that people will take any advantage for any reason and turn that into a privilege, right? The idea then being that any differences between us really are just a matter of some people deciding that other people are going to get advantages with respect to other people. Or the idea might be that, to take another example, some people are wealthier than other people. If wealth just is a privilege, then what that means is that all wealth is just somehow a social granting of an advantage to some people compared to other people. Other people just weren't granted this wealth somehow, and that's meant to undercut or obliterate the idea that some people, when they get their wealth, they earned it by their own efforts, right? So it's an earned value that they have. It's not a privilege that somehow they've been socially magically acquired. So that's a set of issues. So one conceptual clarification will be anytime we're talking about advantages or disadvantages that people have, are those earned advantages? Are they natural advantages? Or are they in fact privileges that have been granted by some social authorities or not? Now, that's one element, right, built into what you're saying. Now, the other part of it, and this is the second part, was the turning of everything into an ad hominem argument. That then is to say, in case someone's not familiar with the language, instead of addressing the person's argument, what you do is you address a feature of the person that's not relevant to the argument. So, to take a stupid person, or to take a stupid example, if you, Lucas, were to say, that you think 12 multiplied by 11 equals 132, and you laid out your reasons for that, and I just said, hey, that's the wrong answer. You're just a white guy saying that. So what I'm clearly doing is I'm not addressing your mathematical reasoning and assessing it in its own terms. I'm setting that aside and I'm focusing on your skin color, which is irrelevant to the quality of your mathematical reasoning. So anytime you see someone saying, as a white person, or as a male, or as a European, if that feature is not directly related to the quality of the utterance that the person is making, that's an illegitimate move. But what we do have is a large number of people who want to say, I'm not interested in having to deal with people's arguments. I want to find a way to short circuit anyone's argument by finding some irrelevant trait, but not one that I know that's going to have some rhetorical force against the person. So to come back to our working example, of slavery, the idea then, and this is the illegitimate tactic of people who have a certain stance with respect to slavery and certain policy implications that they want to have forwarded, they don't want to have a debate about competing theories about slavery and competing debates about the policy implication. So one very cheap tactic then is to say, I can get anybody who disagrees with me dismissed from the debate by using ad hominem tactics. I can say, oh, you're a rich guy, so therefore your position, your argument just is invalidated, and only poor people can have a position on this. Or your skin is not the right color, therefore you're not allowed to have an argument with respect to this issue. And that's just cheating.
So because and is it that they're doing wordplay? They're conflating advantage, which is something whether that you're born with or born, your parents gave you, whether it's wealth or an education. They're conflating advantage with privilege.
Yes.
And then another thing, it seems like you're making it's boiling down to power structures, that it's not based on any sort of, I think that the argument that I hear when you say, 11 times 12 is 132, the argument on the other side is, if using that as an example where we're actually talking about something that's a little bit more complex, would be like, well, that's
the video broke just for a moment there. I didn't hear what the example was.
When we take the example that you gave of 11 times 12 is 132, as a white person arguing at that, it seems like the other side would say, well, you're just saying that because, you've come from this place of privilege and we need to re-examine that. And then also what I hear you saying with this privilege versus advantage, there's this video that's been going around about, I think it's like a poverty kind of exercise where they take middle school kids and, if you're born with two parents, take 2 steps forward, and, so the list goes on, and there's only a $100 bill at the end. And so it seems like you're also, that there's also been an argument made that this is all a zero-sum game, and that if I have an advantage, that you don't have that advantage, and that's unfair, because you were talking about money and wealth, that if I have wealth, whether it's I worked hard for it or my parents worked hard for it and it was given to me, which is you're saying is an advantage, they're saying that's actually a corrupt value, and you need to forfeit that because it's a privilege that other people don't have.
Yeah, that's very good. So that's a second element that's part of the worldview that we're discussing. The first part is a cognitive element or an epistemological element that says that there is no such thing as objective truth. Rather, each group has its own truths or its own ways of looking at the world, and those are conditioned into its members. So
just based on where they were born, their parents, the language.
yeah, as a right, whatever, instead of as a human being with a mind that can assess facts objectively about the world. So that's one set of issues. But yes, you're exactly right that another element of this worldview is this zero sum premise that there's a certain amount of stuff, and if some people get more, sometimes it's wealth, sometimes it's social standing or reputation. But if some people have more, that necessarily means other people have less. And that position is deeply baked into, right, some worldviews. But what it then denies is that anybody has the capacity to create new wealth in the world. And that if anybody has more wealth than anybody else, that wealth could somehow be earned. So it is denying two very important facts about the world, that wealth is created and that there's a justice point that's built into this, that the people who do the actual creation of wealth deserve to have more wealth. It's to deny that possibility and the justice attached to it.
So I mean, but what's so wrong about that worldview? Like, what's so wrong about the fact that people want to help the disempowered, to help minorities, to help
No,
the
there's nothing wrong with
ecosystem?
wanting to help minorities and help the disempowered, but if you are attacking the very notions that make it possible for the poor and the disempowered to become more powerful, then you are actually destroying the very people that you think you are helping.
Wait,
And
so
if you
can you say that
are
again?
going to do that by attacking people who have lifted themselves out of disadvantaged situations and out of poverty situations, then you are committing an injustice to them. So just on the zero sum point, if you consider the way the world was 300 years ago, the early United States, if you go to the poorest Southeast Asian nations right now and the poorest African nations right now, all of them are wealthier than average Americans were in 1700.
Wow.
Now, again, that's a historical fact. Where did all of that wealth come from? Right. So you go to the contemporary United States. So we are now 300 years later. It's not the case that skyscrapers were just lying around and computer systems were lying around, or that all of those movies and music that we enjoy, that adds riches to our lives, and all of the cars were just lying around. Someone had to do a lot of thinking and inventing and take entrepreneurial risk and build up huge systems. All of that wealth was created. And that's a historical fact. So the question then is, if you are genuinely interested in helping the poor, and I'm a little bit cynical about 30-year-old people who say that they want to help the poor, but buy into any sort of a zero-sum premise. If you're 16 and you don't know anything about history, you don't know anything about economics, and somehow it just seems magical that some people have a lot of money and some people don't have wealth, well, that's one thing. You're just a kid still at that point, however intelligent you are. But I think there's no excuse for people who are university educated and older, who should know something about the world, for saying that wealth creation doesn't exist, that everything is just a zero-sum distribution. That's just an intellectual abdication. And at that point, I don't think those people really are interested in helping the poor and helping the disadvantaged. I think what's going on is they have bought into a worldview. They have a philosophy. They have a political ideology. They are invested in that ideology, and they're going to preserve that ideology no matter what its effect is on poor people.
So you mentioned two things. First was, in the beginning of the question, you said something to the effect of, you're destroying the very by attacking the wealthy and the idea that wealth can be created, and saying that we're going to take away what that side of the argument terms as a privilege, but you're saying it's really just an advantage from their hard work or their height. By taking that away, that you're also taking away the very thing that could empower the poor.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you think of the lesson that the target group in this case, so to take the stereotype of the poor black kid, right, in a terrible neighborhood, you go in and you tell that kid the reason you are in the situation you are in is because there's all these other people in other neighborhoods who have money and different skin color, and they've taken it from you and your people. And they have all of the power, and they don't like you, and they are making all of the rules so that you will stay exactly where you are. And basically, there's nothing that you can do.
But isn't that
What's
the
going to
argument
happen to
of
that kid?
isn't it the argument of gentrification? That's what I've been hearing. When I'm having these conversations, they come back with, well, it's probably because of gentrification, and it's further evidence of racism, where neighborhoods gentrify, and the poor minorities are forced into bad neighborhoods. So isn't that the argument to say, well, that is true because you've been pushed to the margins of society?
Well, who's doing the pushing here, right? And this goes back though to the point. If you are a young kid, it doesn't matter what your skin color is, what your wealth background is, what your education background is. Do you think any young kid, if the kid has the freedom, can say, assess my situation? I'm in a pretty bad neighborhood here, but I can go for a walk and I can see that things are a little bit better 3 blocks to the south. I can see they're a lot better 20 blocks to the south, and that's where I want to be. And then to start thinking, what do I need to do in order to get there? Made those people able to do what it is that they're doing. It might start from a very simple thing like, picking up your yard so you don't have trash. It might be a simple thing like taking a shower every day or two. It might be a simple thing like paying attention and realizing in school, realizing that when you read a book, you learn new things and developing habits in yourself. So the question is going to be, what's the best lesson all of us can teach to that young kid? Do those things, and you can move to that neighborhood in 10 years that's 3 blocks down the road, and maybe even to the nicer neighborhood that's 20 blocks down the road. If you don't believe in that message, and I think our enemies really are the people who don't believe in that message. That's a philosophical position that they're taking. Then you are never going to get out of that poor neighborhood. Instead, if you teach people the disempowering neighborhood, that you are a victim, that the forces of the world are trying to keep you in a victim state, then you are going to just set those young people up for greater failure. So, my view on if you take gentrification, right, as a particular issue, gentrification should be seen as a positive thing, because then what you have is some people showing other people what's possible. So here is a somewhat derelict building, right? We come in, we paint it, we clean up the brick, we do nice things, and everybody else walks by and says, hey, wow, something that's falling into disrepair, that can be turned around. And I like that. And that's what I want to do. So I start with wherever I am, even if I'm in a bad situation, I'm going to gentrify myself, metaphorically speaking, and so forth. So it should be an inspiration rather than a condemnation.
So you're saying it really comes back down to the individual, that individual has power. Power is not the right word that I'm looking
Agency.
for. Agency. Thank you. That individual has agency to affect change in their life. But the narrative that I hear, and I was having a conversation with someone in December, and the conversation started off with, we're not individuals, we're just individuals. That we're not unique beings, but we are just, subsets of the group that we live in. Where do all of these ideas come from, and where do they all lead? Because it seems like really, really great things like, oh yeah, I am just, the makeup of my culture, But they seem innocent. But where does this all lead?
Yes. All right. So that's also very good. So now we're introducing clearly a third element in the package, right? The first element was there is no objective truth or objectivity possible. It's all just subjective things that one happens to believe for whatever one. The second element is there is no wealth creation, that everything is a zero sum distribution according to unfair power dynamics. And the third element is that there is no individuality, there is no agency, there is no self empowerment. Instead, one is an aspect of the group or a representative of the group, or one is some sort of a collective being. Now, that's exactly to correct in identifying, right, what the issues are. But yeah, we have three elements now that are coming together into a package. So now the follow-up question then is, where does that come from? Well, in many cases there's a lot of high theory behind it. There are a lot of psychological theories that have argued that the human mind is plastic, and perhaps, say, in the example of language formation, when we are young, we're in a surrounding language culture, and the language culture is just glommed onto our brain, and we learn to think the way our group language, right, thinks. There are sociological versions of this. Marxism is one, but not the only one. People are born into economic circumstances, but economic circumstances shape your being and your way of thinking about the world. And there are also, of course, racial versions of it, that there are different racial groups and they each have their own biological package. And so your thinking and your feeling and your way of being is merely kind of an expression of an underlying biological racial type. So there are lots of theories out there that deny individual agency. So the other side of the debate, though, is a position that says no, volition is a real phenomenon, right? We do have the psychological capacity to turn our minds on, to make a decision. I'm going to think about things, or I'm just going to be lazy, to direct our attention. I'm going to think about this thing as opposed to thinking about that thing. And also to act. I'm sitting here thinking about a particular thing, whether I stand up or whether I stay seated down. That is an individual agency. I can decide to stay seated or get up, and that's a real phenomenon. Now, that's of course to take us into the free will versus determinism, right, or volition versus various kinds of conditioning debates, and those are deep debates in philosophy. So the point, though, is going to be that exactly right, that part of the activist package that we are hearing a lot and a lot more in this last generation are people who have very strongly bought into denying individuality and denying agency. And to the extent that you buy into that as a very general principle, that has a lot of implications. So when you come to the people whom your heart initially goes out to because they are not in a very good situation, that's going to be very upsetting. And we know that sometimes people are in bad situations because of past historical injustices. That's going to make you very angry. But you, because of your commitment to the lack of individual agency, you're going to not believe in the only tool that's going to help people get out of that. You're not going to say, what I need to tell these people and help them realize is that they can take some significant measure of control over their own lives, change their thinking, change their behaviors, do certain actions that are going to get them out of their bad situations. You're not going to believe in any of that. Instead, you are going to engage in what will in fact be counterproductive methods.
So, is this a new phenomenon? Both the idea that we're just part of a group and our identity and our language is just all baked in by our environment, and also, is it a new idea that we are individuals who have free will? Like, as for all time, we've believed that we are individuals with free will, and this is something new?
Yeah, no, the individualism and agency, free will point is much more strongly a product of the modern world. So if you think, for example, most of human history, and now here we're playing amateur anthropologist, right? Human beings were in tribal organizations, and almost all tribes. This is an overstatement, but they had the idea that boys were born to do men's work, girls were born to do to do girls' work, and so already you're not really an individual; you are typed and conditioned right from day one in terms of what your social role is going to be. And also, we do know that those economies were largely subsistence economies. So there's some understanding that yes, tools need to be made, wealth needs to be, weapons need to be made, clothes need to be made. But the idea that we can create abundance was certainly not a notion. As economies became more sophisticated, we had empires that would rigidify into feudal systems. But again, what's noted there is, aside from the sexual division, boys do boy things, girls do girls things. You have over many, many generations the idea that you're born into a certain class and your whole life is largely mapped out in terms of your class membership. You're a serf or you're a peasant, right? Or your dad is the duke and you're the firstborn son, you are going to be the next duke, right? Or you're a little girl, you are going to be married off to somebody and you start to produce babies. So the idea of individual agency and volition, again, is extraordinarily limited. It's really not until you get to the Renaissance of the 1400s, the long 1400s, that you start to see, particularly in the commercial republics of Florence, especially, and in Venice, the idea of individuality, that you can think for yourself, create yourself into the kind of human being that you want to. And you see this in the artists, particularly artists like Michelangelo, who start to assert themselves that I have my own vision. And then as feudal structures started to be challenged in those places, and people started to see that people could make a lot of money if they took certain paths and made certain choices in life, or that we can take charge of our political system, as those early republics did, and make a difference. The rules of the game are not from God or from feudal privilege in time immemorial. We make the rules because we control the political system as small r Republicans. So it's a relatively new idea that I can be in charge of my thinking, my dress, my style, my interests, my economic destiny, my political destiny. At most 500, maybe 650 years or so. But of course, that's a blink of an eye in historical time. And the battle has been deep and increasingly sophisticated over the course of the last centuries.
So one thing that I hear, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, and you touched on it again, it's this idea that, Africa and I think you said South Asia, they have more wealth, less poverty than America did in the 1700s.
Yes.
But there's an argument that is, well, that's a bad thing, in the fact that, well, that's because of colonialism, and that's because the white man has come and enforced capitalism upon these people, and it's actually better that they stayed in their cultural, tribal identities, and it's actually this whitewashing.
Yeah. Well, that's a set of propositions. There's a grain of truth in a couple of them, but the overall package is quite bad. I think anyone who looks at the historical record and says that the average African now is in a worse situation than an average African 600 years ago, I mean, that's just astounding historical ignorance. And I don't think there's any excuse for that. So, if you go back, 500 years ago, and you look at just, one portion of Africa, life expectancies were extraordinarily low in the 20s or 30s, right? So, just take the contemporary Congo, and then all of the countries on the southern part of sub-Saharan Africa in there, right, going on down to Angola. So now life expectancy is more than twice, right, what it was just a few centuries ago. So anybody who wants to say, oh, that's a bad thing, I'm sorry, that's just ignorance. The amount of music and economic opportunity that's available to people now, contemporary Africans, compared to 4 or 5 or 6 centuries ago, astoundingly different. And it's also that the vast majority of those states were slave states. I mean, all of the slaves that were exported to the Arabian nations and across the Atlantic, they were vast majority, 99% of them, other African tribes conquering and taking people as slaves to be sold to the Arabs and to be sold to the Europeans engaged. So the fact that a significant portion of the economy was a slave economy, and something like 75 or 80% of the people living in those countries were living as slaves, whereas now there still is slavery, but it's a small minority of the population and mostly underground. Anybody who says that's not an improvement, again, I think is historically ignorant, right, at best. Now, the second part of what you were saying is the legacy of colonialism. And clearly colonialism is an extraordinarily mixed record. And I think one needs to get nuanced pretty quickly. The historical track records of British colonialism compared to, say, Portuguese colonialism and Spanish and German and French colonialism. Those are very mixed records. The ones that I know the most about, growing up in Canada and living most of my career in the United States, is the legacy mostly of British colonialism. So, then you can say, obviously, the British did all sorts of bad things in their colonial empires all over the world. But at the same time, the British did all sorts of good things, right, all over the world. So if we consider Hong Kong right now, so you're living in Hong Kong right now, do we want to say to the Hong Kongers right now, it's really so sad that the British colonialized you, a century ago? And in that case, it seems to be pretty ridiculous. Obviously, the British did some bad things in Hong Kong over the course of the last 120 years or so. But Hong Kong is a magnificent accomplishment. And part of what made it a magnificent accomplishment was precisely that the British came in and set up certain institutions. And those institutions made Hong Kong able to do very good things. The record of British colonialism, I think, in the Middle East, before and after World War II, that's a much more mixed, with a lot of terrible things that are going on. British in South Africa, again, a much more mixed record, right, and so forth. But, the example I like to give here is the example of Botswana, if we're going to focus on Africa, for example. So I like to look at Botswana, which is a landlocked southern African nation, and its neighbor, Zimbabwe, another landlocked southern African nation. And both of them were colonies, right, of the British, right, up until the 1960s or so. Both of them similar histories, tribal mix of natural resources. Actually, the Zimbabweans have slightly better natural resources. Botswana is mostly Kalahari Desert, if you look at the geography. But both of them achieved independence, right, from the British. So everything then is pretty much the same history, same mix of tribes, religions, natural resources, colonial history, and so forth. Both achieve independence. What the Zimbabweans decide at that point is, we are going to effectively stop doing everything that the British wanted us to do, and we're going to import a different ideology. So, long story short, they decided that they were going to become Germans of a certain sort and become Marxist revolutionaries, and so they became a kind of communist socialist state. But what the Botswanans did was to say, after they got rid of the British, just to say, we think the British institutions are common law, education, markets, and so forth, pretty good, and we're going to take ownership of them and be self-ruling and so on, and we're going to continue, in effect, to do things the British way. So what we have is almost a perfect social science experiment where one country says, we're going to use British institutions, the other says we're going to use imported German institutions, and Zimbabwe became a basket case, and Botswana became one of the richest, if not the richest, Southern African nation. And my understanding is, if you look at the current numbers, the average Botswanan right now is about 8 times as rich as the average Zimbabwean, and lives more than 12 years longer than the average Zimbabwean does. So, we can debate the merits and demerits of colonialism, right? Absolutely. But to say that colonialism makes everybody a victim, and that, I think, is a huge historical overstatement and a disservice. Sometimes colonies bring good ideas, and not all colonialism is enforced at the point of a gun. Sometimes it's a mixture of voluntary import-export that's going on. So
that is all that we have for part 1 of this 2-part episode with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Stick around for the next episode, where we are going to be talking about, the fruit of radical Marxism, and we're going to continue that conversation right over into the next episode. I love hearing from you and answering your questions. If you have a question from this episode or any other episode, please WhatsApp me at +1 202 922 0220. That's 1-202 922 0220. And I look forward to hearing from you. Remember, I'm Lucas Grobot. You are a change maker, so go out and own the future.